Thanks, guys, for joining the 11 o'clock session. My name is Brady Dykema with Network Center. Not presenting, but just here to introduce our Vice President of Operations at Network Center, Todd Bortke. Real quick, lunch is served after this in the main hall, so head on over there for lunch once this session is done. Todd has worked extensively in the healthcare information technology field, as well as management and operations. I'm going to let him introduce himself a little more, but give him a quick round of applause, please.
Thanks, Brady. So I'm between you and lunch, so thank you. Appreciate that. As Brady said, I've spent a majority of my career in healthcare, in a regulated industry, and for the last 3.5 years have had an opportunity to work at NCI and get to work with a lot of different vendors, a lot of different verticals and so forth. So with that, what I want to talk about today is data governance for all. And so you could actually talk about data governance for financial institutions or healthcare or private business or public entities, right? So today we're going to talk about it kind of in a generic term about from an overall perspective. So hopefully each of you get a chance to take a little bit away with whatever type of vertical that you're representing sitting here today. So, and thanks for attending. So we'll talk about data governance. It's a little different from information governance or information management. What I want to cover today and what I hope at the end of the session you get out of it is what the objectives are for data governance. So what it is, why an organization should do it or should consider putting a data governance culture in place, who would be responsible for this in your organization, and then where does it exist, right? Where does it live within the organization? And from there, we'll then talk about when. When should you look at a data governance program, a data governance culture? One thing I want to call out is it is not a project. It's not something that you will start and put an end date to. Data governance is an opportunity to set the culture in your organization that the information that you have, that the data you have, that you're holding that data because you believe there's value in it. Why would you hold data if there's no value to it, right? Well, you might have to hold it for regulatory reasons, true. But most likely you want to hold the data in your organization because there's value to it and you want to drive business proposition from that. So the objectives, we're going to need to understand the opportunity to capitalize, right? We have to capitalize on information that's within the organization. And just having data and just having information is not the valuable part. It's making it actionable. And sometimes you'll take a step forward with that data. Sometimes you'll hit the pause button because you found some data that you really need to analyze. And sometimes you may step back and take another direction based on, again, that data that you have. So it's really the actionable piece of that data is why you want to look at a data governance culture. One of the things you'll have to do is you'll have to describe how deploying data governance program, how that can help you address competing initiatives. We'll talk about the need to budget for a data governance culture. It's not necessarily a financial budget, but it's a budget of resource, time, and energy, which again has a cost to it, right? But there's competing projects, whether it's an HR project, whether it's a CRM project, whether it's a sales tool, or anything, right? You're going to have competing initiatives around data. And having a governance program will help you manage that life cycle of that and that change management that happens with it. You want to lay the foundation so that it's effective, right? Like I said, it's not a project that you start and you stop and you say, yep, we completed, we check mark it on the box and we go forward. It's really about changing the culture within the organization. And then we have to balance the need of compliance, the need of privacy, and the need of security. The one thing I did not mention here, I mention it later, is the need for access. Who needs to get access to the data you have? Can they get to it? Can they get to it quickly? Are they able to get to it securely? Are you able to make sure that when they get to it, they don't put it in a scenario or a situation where you don't have control of it anymore. So again, those are some objectives of why you want to consider moving to a data governance culture within your organization if you already haven't. Some of you here may say, hey, we're already there. We're in a mature cycle of data governance. Others may not have started yet. That's okay. It's all about moving forward. So what is it? You know, again, we can talk about culture, we can talk about the words, right? But really, what is it? It's the overall management of data. Is it available? How usable is it? Are you absolutely sure of the integrity of the data? And are you positive that it's secure? Are you sure you don't have any areas where data loss can happen? And if there's a potential for data loss, how do you know that it's there? It's an accountability framework, and it's to ensure that there's appropriate behavior around data. Again, we talk about the value of it. We talk about the creation, the storage, the use, the archiving. This is one point I want you to remember. If you remember one thing stepping out of here, it's also the deletion of data. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but if I think about it, I wonder how many of you in here have a very aggressive culture or a very aggressive procedural process that you delete data in your organization securely when you no longer need it. So being in healthcare, there's a time frame of discoverability. Being in the legal profession, there's a time frame of discoverability. There's data you probably have in your organization that you should be trimming, that you should be deleting. And are you sure you're deleting it from every location that it exists? And are you sure it's not recoverable after you delete it? So in short, it's the practice of knowing where your data is, and I'm sure everybody knows exactly where all their data is right now. Is it different than last night? Is it different from this morning? Did you just do a payroll run at 9 o'clock and so now it exists somewhere else? How is it being utilized? Do you know how all your data is being utilized? And do you know how often it's being utilized? And do you know who's utilizing it? And then whether or not it's adequately protected. So when we talk about the culture of data governance, the data needs to be protected when it's being used, right? It needs to be protected when it's in transit. It needs to be protected when it's being stored somewhere. And I suspect everybody's been thinking about data to this point electronically. How many of you have a file cabinet or multiple file cabinets in your organization? Prior to the prevalence of electronic health records, everything was in a paper chart. How much of that data still sits in paper? So data exists not only electronically, but it exists in paper. So from a security, a compliance, a destruction, I'm not just talking about the electronic side of it. It's the paper side of it. How many business partners do you have that maybe today you still have to do something on a sheet of paper or a physical signature versus electronic? Again, there's been a big migration of that, right, with the automation in the last 3 years. But still, when you think of data governance, I don't want you thinking just electronic. It's probably where you're going to spend most of your time thinking about it. But again, there still is that whole paper world. Is that jiggling for your eyes too? Or did I have too much coffee? I'm just checking. So again, continuing with what it is. It's defining what data means to the organization. It's one of the core data best practices. You need to define what the data means to you. Sometimes the data in an organization has a different value. It could be proprietary. If you're applying for a patent, the value of that data might be whether your organization makes a strategic move forward or steps back. Maybe the data is public information and it exists, out there in lots of different fashions. Eliminating the barriers to the legitimate use of data. I can't tell you how many times in my previous work at the medical center that we had individuals that said, I need access to X, whatever X is, and they had a legitimate business reason. And a lot of times it took a pretty big effort to understand that we needed to change security or roles or privileges. And the more you can do role-based elevation for individuals within your organization about the data they need to get to, because more and more people are wearing more and more hats in different areas. You still have people who are very siloed and very specific of what the data they need to do their job all day long, but there's a lot of people that world is getting larger, and they need access to multiple pieces of different information. So good data ensures that the data has integrity, consistency, it's not misused or mishandled, it's protected, it's actionable, and it's accessible to those who are approved to use it. I want to touch a little bit on integrity. Data gets created by a system or by somebody. Are you validating that the integrity of that creation isn't changing? That there's no anomalies happening when that data gets created? Is it consistently getting created at the same time of the day or the same time of the month or the same time of the year? Is it consistently being deleted at the same time of the year or whenever you have your trimming function of bringing your data sets back? At the end today, I'll make a reference to a study that's talking about that enterprises are creating 63% additional data every month. That's an enormous amount of data. I didn't think it was that large. But again, the data is just growing and growing and growing. And again, are you trimming your data back to using it just to an actionable data set? Is it protected? So talking about if you move information via different medias, right? Via email, via FTP services, via HL7, any other kind of API integration you have, are you sure that it's protected 100% from the time it starts to move until the time it's sitting at rest? Again, don't need to show of hands, but I wonder how many organizations have completely blocked USB media. There was a study done a few years ago where at a government agency, they walked outside in a parking lot and they dropped 20 USB sticks. And as soon as those got plugged in, it reported back. I think the number was around 17 or 18 of those USB sticks got picked up and plugged back into a federal government machine that then reported back, even though policy and training and everything says, don't do it. Human nature, people were inquiring about what it was. So do you have data loss protection in your organization? Why? So once you define what the data means to your organization and you formulate ways to use your data to advance your business, that's a why. I mean, there's a lot of businesses that they make decisions immediately or long-term based on the data they have. Data analytics is a big thing. Artificial intelligence, business intelligence is a big thing. So we're going to talk about that more today. Today's world is so dynamic and it's ever-changing, and so it is a must. Even though you may not call it a data governance culture within your organization, the elements of data governance are a must. You have a responsibility to protect the data of your organization, of your employees, whether that's an HR system, of your customers, whether that's a financial institution or a healthcare institution. You have that responsibility. You should be conveying to your boards of directors, if you have board of directors, that they have a fiscal responsibility to ensure the integrity and the security of that data. Yesterday it was announced again. Unfortunately, there's another healthcare system that just $425,000 fine yesterday for a breach that happened out on the East Coast. It's not a big company. It's actually a small healthcare facility. I wonder whether or not that $500,000 penalty will allow them to continue to deliver services the way they have. And it all came in via phishing. So the phishing email saga continues. Excuse me. Businesses today, they capture massive amounts of data from a variety of sources. A couple of years ago at Envision, I had the opportunity to talk about big data. And I used an analogy, or I gave an example of railways, where on the different cars they have on their trains, they're listening for the sound that their wheels make as they go across the tracks. They're able to analyze that sound and determine if a track is becoming less strengthful, so that there could be a potential of an accident. And so they can tell by the sounds coming off the rails and the wheels. And so you think about how automation can help. How can you analyze all that data almost real time? So the last part here is about an active data governance structure and framework. It provides the data that's consistent, reliable, right? There's a recurring theme here. It's making sure that the data has value and that the integrity of the value is there. And really, it's allowing you as an organization to be much more proactive with your business rather than reactive. Now, it's really important to be reactive to data you have. Don't get me wrong there. But the sooner you can act to that and become proactive, the quicker the response you and your customers will see. And for most companies, that will benefit them tremendously. It may give them a step ahead of their competition. It may get them faster to market on something. So again, it's all around the data. Who owns it? You guys do. Every one of you in this room, I would suspect and put out there that you have a responsibility, and that data governance starts with you. Whether you're the CEO or any other position within an organization, if you have access to data, you have the responsibility to protect that. You have the responsibility to drive your business forward with that. It's an organizational strategy. It's a culture. It is, like I said, it's not a project like I mentioned earlier. It requires executive leadership, not sponsorship. That would be a second item I'd like you to make sure you take away from this is it's not a sponsorship. You need to be an executive leader. It's got to be well-funded with adequate resources. And again, it's primarily the human element of resources. It doesn't cost financially an expense that you're paying out. It's the expense of staff. It's the expense of saying, yes, we have to spend time and continually look at where our data is at. Look at, are we doing what we need to do to protect it? Can we recover from an incident? And if so, how long will it take us? And do we have alternative plans during an issue if we are having an incident response situation? I just put some titles up here, right? Chief Information Officer, Chief Data Officer, Compliance Officer, Security Officer, data owners, data stewards, data governance committee, all of your employees. I think data stewards is something that doesn't get talked about a lot. And those are the people that have their hands on the data, changing the data, modifying the data, adding it, deleting it, day in and day out. Very, very critical. Very critical. Where is it? It's everywhere in your organization. It's just not in IT. It's just not in the CFO's world. It's just not in finance. It's everywhere. Sandy this morning alluded to the fact, or gave some examples, right, of how over the years the technology's changed, and we have a human capital issue right now, right? Staffing, and how we look to change and use automation and move staff into areas where they can do direct customer support or direct healthcare, for example, as she was using. So again, it's everywhere. It may be outside your organization. Again, not knowing the businesses you represent, but you might have customers, you might have business partners. Maybe you're importing sales catalogs, like in our business, of SKUs from different vendors that we sell hardware of, right? Are we absolutely positive that there's not a problem in that data that's going to corrupt some of our data? Are we putting information out on our website that's correct? Are we making sure that we never publicly put some information out there that's private data? Who's double checking? People are human, people make errors. How can we build a governance program around it to try to mitigate that risk as small as possible? It might still happen, and that's where your recovery point is, right? And that's where your data loss prevention and some of your other things. But again, how can we make sure that if we're collaborating with our customers or our business partners, that we're holding the data we get from them or the data we send to them in very high confidence? And are we using the data as actionable? I can't stress this enough. Where's data governance? It should never, ever be outside your organization. If you're letting data outside of your organization, it should either be for public use, and you don't care who has it, and you don't care what anybody does with it. But if you have private information that's outside of your control, I venture to say you have an issue. And if it hasn't become an issue, be very grateful, but try to do something to really get that back in your control. There's a lot of things that can help with that. But again, if you let data outside your organization, you have to understand that if it gets in another set of hands, what can happen with it. But on the other hand, it might be public information. It might be exactly what you want to put out there. Maybe you have to produce an annual report and there's financial information in that. Just make sure it's correct. When should you do this? Hopefully you were doing it yesterday. And if not, hopefully something you hear today might trigger a spark, right? That says, yep, we should start. And if not, maybe tomorrow. But start now. It's never too late to start. Just start. And it doesn't have to be a huge, elaborate program, right? I almost said project, and that's not the right word. It doesn't have to be a huge program. You can start and you can go from infancy to maturity at the rate that your organization can consume that. So how to start? Well, define some goals, understand the benefits. Maybe it's one piece of data that you want to look at. Maybe it's a whole segment of your business. Maybe it's HR. Maybe it's customer data set. I don't know. Analyze what you currently have. Analyze where your data is today and do a delta analysis on it. Drive a roadmap from that analysis. Convince stakeholders and budget for the project. And when I say budget, again, I'm talking about the human capital side of budgeting for a team that can stand up this culture. Implement the program, and as you implement it, monitor it. Just like your data is changing every day, you're going to have to monitor what you're doing from a governance program every day, monthly, quarterly. Next steps. We'll spend some time on this. What data do you have? You have local data? You have data in the cloud? Do you have data on USB drives? Do you have data on mobile devices? Where'd the data come from? Are you sure that the data that you're bringing into the organization, that there's no possible way it could contaminate or encrypt your data that you weren't expecting? How's the data used? Who's responsible for the data? Can we trust the data? Here's a big one. Is the data duplicated somewhere else? Anybody ever been in front of your executive committee or your board of directors or something where there's a report given that says, here's our question, here's the answer, only at next month's meeting, the same question, a different answer comes forward because two different departments or two different data sets were used to analyze the same question, and you have conflicting information. Why should you have duplicate data? You should have a single source of truth, and you should control the access to modify, change, and to get to that data set. Now, there's reasons to have duplicate data off-site and from a recovery point and all of that. I'm not saying that that's not important. But if you're analyzing data, you should be using it from a single source of truth. Do we have data that contradicts this data? Again, that might be from a business partner. So we say X, they say Y. Is it within our own control that we have two different sets of data? And then start small in one step at a time. So I wish this picture was more circular. This talks about change management. And again, change management, you know, outside of data governance, you probably should have policies and standards, right? You have the information quality that we've talked about, making sure it's there. You have privacy and compliance and security concerns, again, depending on what regulatory world you might be in. And then you have the whole architecture and the integration, like where's your data being stored? Who handles that storage? How's that being integrated to backups? How's that integrated to data loss protection? How's that integrated to a recovery point? And then on the bottom, you have, of course, you have technology and people. But it's a circle. It never ends. No matter where you're at in that circle, just continue, and you'll come back around to that. That's really about change management. In a data governance, it doesn't ever stop, and it shouldn't. It should always be evolving. So what are the goals of data governance? Minimize risk. You may not be able to eliminate risk, but you should be able to minimize it. Establish internal rules for the use of the data. Again, compliance requirements are changing all the time. You have to stay ahead of that. Improve internal and external communications. Increase the value of data. How do you increase the value of your data? Well, there's a lot of different ways to do that. Expand your data set. Maybe shrink your data set. There's people that specialize in data analytics. There's software from a data analytics that can help you. It can help you reduce costs. That can be a goal of a data governance. Help ensure the continued existence of the company through the management and the optimization. How many companies can recover from a security incident if they don't have a solid governance program? Data classification. So again, once you know where your data is and you understand what the data has in it, then you need to classify it. So data classification is a process of fundamentally categorizing your data under different categories, right? You could use level of sensitivity, you could use type of data, location of the data, the personnel who have access to the data. So again, there's not a single way to classify data. You'll have to work through that in your organization about the classifications of data. I gave the example, right, that if you're an organization that might have a patent pending, that classification of data is going to be different than maybe just a healthcare facility that has different classifications of data. You know your organization. You build the classifications out that you feel are most important. Fully understanding the type of data that is stored, how much of the data has been retained at different locations is vital to keeping the organization compliant. I go back to trimming data. I wonder how many of you have a very aggressive process that removes data from the organization when it's no longer valid or does not need to be discoverable, for example. I can't move the slides forward. Thank you. Just some examples. So, controlled unclassified information. It requires safeguarding, or you have to have dissemination controls. Again, applicable law could be local, could be based on your vertical, could be state, could be federal, could be international. So there's export controlled, right? So it depends on the business you're in. You might have federal regulatory requirements. There's restricted areas around personally identifiable information, right? Social security number is an example, driver's license, passport number. In healthcare, protected health information, there's 18 data fields that if any one of those single fields is in a data set, it's considered PHI data. PCI, how many of you take credit cards or have the whole PCI industry that you have to work with? So again, I'm not sharing anything new, right, that hasn't been around for a while. It's really the process of how often are you continuing to review and stay in front of from a data governance perspective. Controlled access, again, do you know if there's an unauthorized disclosure? And if so, who do you have to report it to? How many days do you have to report it to that organization, for example? Was the data destroyed inappropriately? If so, how do you monitor for that? And then there's public data. A lot of times there's controlled data or there's data that needs to be kept private, but at some point it becomes public. How do you make sure that that transition happens appropriately? Again, patent pending information is an example, right? Once it's patented and becomes public information, not everything becomes public, just a portion of that data. So how do you control what portion becomes public versus what is still maintained from a security perspective? Okay, you heard Andrew mention it earlier, and this is something that I have a lot of responsibility in our organization for, so I just want to call out kind of a security alert again. We have a lot of you are customers, right? We thank you for that. Some of you still have 2012 server in your organization. There are some companies that still maintain 2008 servers for whatever reason. So upgrade, but there are some software applications that under law still have to be held. So, think about your architectural design in your network. Maybe you need to silo off a server that's no longer supported, but contains data that you need to keep. So again, thousands and thousands and thousands of man hours are sitting out there that have to happen in the next 11 months. So that's my my customer alert for the morning. So I want to do some question and answer here. Again, data governance for all, it was kind of generic in the fashion that we tried to touch all verticals. But at the end of the day, you have a responsibility to protect the data, to help your organization grow with the data you have there. And again, it's not a project. It's not owned by IT. It is an organizational strategy. And those companies that use their data aggressively are typically in a better position than some of their competitors. So with that, I'll take some questions if anybody has any. Yes?
Hey, Todd, thank you. So you had mentioned about measuring and monitoring your data governance. How can you do that? It seems like a nebulous concept in some ways.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The question was, how do you monitor and measure your data governance in a program? I think you can do it a couple of different ways based on what your objective was to start with. If your objective of starting data governance was to understand where your data sits and who has access to that, you can use log analysis work to help you after you've defined what data sits where. So again, it's doing the first components first before the monitoring and kind of the QA. I think the second part of that can be an internal SWOT analysis, right? An internal analysis of, are you looking at data usage based on privileged access? Are you making sure that you're measuring when somebody leaves your organization that their access is terminated in the appropriate time, right? So we kind of got out of data governance and went into, account management. But account management of privileging the account and removing the account should be part of your overall data governance. So again, I think it depends on what the goals you set. If you get really aggressive and want to make sure that you're monitoring input and exporting of data coming in and out of your organization, there's some tools and some logs that you can look at from that also about, are you doing QA? And so there's different ways, I think, based on the different goal. But it's going to take some effort. And whether you can put automation around that effort, yet to be seen, I think, in how you want to monitor and manage. You just can't say you're doing data governance and one time set it all up and spend a year on it and then kind of put it in the back shelf. It's not how it works. So.
Todd, it's a big animal, right? You did a good job of framing it up, and I think everybody could see the importance of it, but in reality, everybody's busy, too. So if help is needed, what does that look like? Where do they get it? Where do they start? What are the places they can turn to? Because it's not like they go out and say, hey, I'm going to buy this piece of software, and I'm going to start doing data governance, and everything's going to be great. Like you said, it's not a project. So where does that help potentially come from?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. So for those virtually, the question was, if an organization wanted to move forward and look for help in a data governance program, where could they look for that? You're right, it's not a piece of software that you're going to go out and license for a year, right? Install it, turn it on, and be done with it. So there's a lot of components to the data governance, right? So At NCI, we have staff that can help you on the architectural side of things, right? Where your data is stored, how it's stored, things like that. Those are kind of product-based, backup recovery, data loss tools. Those, again, are tools that again, our engineers can help dialogue. I've had the privilege before at NCI talking to some boards of directors regarding in healthcare, their responsibility as a board to understand where their security practices are. We talked about security, compliance, and so forth. So we can help have discussions or presentations to boards, to executives about how important this data governance is. It still is going to come back to you and your organization, though, about the culture within. So we can do some advising work, we can do some analysis work, and then there are tools out there that can help you do data discovery and data classification. They get very specific for the type of software you have. So again, do you have an EHR? Do you have a financial package? Do you have a payroll package? And so there's some tools there. So again, trusted advisors, right? So some of those advisors might be with us. Some of those advisors might be other business partners you have. Remember, we talked about data in and out of your business. Maybe one of those trusted advisors happens to be a company that you get a lot of information from. So a lot of different areas to start with, but it's really starting with and setting up what do you first want to try from a data governance? What do you want to protect? And I would say that it's really, you've got to start with understanding where your data is at and exactly what the data represents. Good question. Other questions? Yes.
One of the things that's always concerned me, I'm a financial institution, one of the things that's always concerned me is data leakage. So I always think of people as kind of like deer. They always take the path of least resistance, so they go the easy way. And I was wondering if you might be able to touch on what tools that you know of that help people with the common problem of data leakage.
Good question. So the question was what tools exist or tools that I'm aware of that can help with data leakage. Let's talk about email first, right? There's a number of tools within email solutions or add-ons that will use lexicons or business work intelligence to decide that, oh, this email contains potentially sensitive data based on the vertical you're in. It's used in healthcare a lot. I know it's used in finance. It's used in some other, in law firms quite a bit. And so it'll analyze what's in an email, and it will decide whether or not it needs to build full encryption in it or actually not send the message. So that's one, right? So there's tools on the email side of things that can look for data leakage. There's tools within the actual network infrastructure of your organization that can block data going out certain areas, USB ports. It can block from certain types of services of exporting data, whether those are FTP services or so forth. So there's physical port tools that you can block from a data loss protection, and those exist there. So between email and between USB lockdown, there's GPO policies that you can write that can help you with that. There's log analysis. There's we have some vendors here today that have a full SOC, right? And so that they're from a security operations perspective, they're looking at all inbound and outbound data traffic and looking for anomalies or changes in patterns. So there's a number of them. So with that, I think I will finish up and conclude. I'll be around all day. I love to talk about data and data governance. Thanks for taking a few minutes of your morning. Appreciate it.